Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Methods Guru for Sage Method Space. And I'm joined today by two of the co-authors for a new book called Analyzing Digital Interaction, Wyke, Stommel and David Giles. So I'd like to just start by asking you to talk a little bit about the need for a book like this, because the kinds of digital interactions that people are studying, and maybe the limitations of some of the approaches that have been used.
Well, maybe I can start. Well, basically, the idea for this book came from a request we received from the series editors of a Palgrave series to do a book on online data or online or digital interaction. And the reason we were approached with this request was that we have been working on this type of research and also working together as a network since basically 2012. And we had already organized a couple of conferences and symposia. We did a special issue, and now it was apparently the right time to edit a book together and to bring together some of the people who had joined us for the conferences or symposia. And so that was basically the occasion. And well, so the general context is a series on discursive psychology. And this domain of research also very much relies on conversation analytic methods. And that's basically has always been, since 2012, our attempt to use conversation analytic principles and methods and concepts to what people do online or using digital media. And so it's really about developing methods to try to understand what people do and how they communicate online and using all kinds of media, in contrast to all kinds of big data methods that tend to focus on large corpora and scraping Twitter, etc., to get a general sense of trends, maybe, or maybe also linguistic cues that are used in these settings, while we are much more interested in social processes, relationships, interactions that people have online.
Anything you'd like to add, David?
Well, Vika has provided the broad background to it, yes. I suppose we tend to think of there being two phases, or three phases maybe, in the history of this type of research. And the first goes back to the early days when the internet was first starting to become a mass, well, just before, I suppose, it became a mass medium back in the 90s, when a lot of computer mediated communication researchers started to apply conversation analytic tools to looking at early online interaction, things like news groups and email lists and so on. And that kind of research faded quite a lot in the early 2000s. I think partly because probably most of the people working in that field felt that they'd pretty much covered everything. But that was really before, I suppose, what we call Web 2 and social media and things like that started to develop. So by around 2010, you were starting to see a very different sort of online culture emerging, particularly in terms of interaction styles, and also affordances, and technological affordances and so on, that made it a kind of different object of study. But by that time, in a sense, the CMC people had moved on, they were doing other stuff, and they kind of felt that I think they probably felt that was old hat, really, to start looking at all that kind of thing again. But to us, it was new, and it was particularly new because a lot of the people who were involved in online interaction were just very general public people, rather than being the sort of techie people who were doing all the sort of news groups and email lists and so on back in the 90s. So we're really interested in seeing how mass society was being represented online, and well, not just represented, but actually it was creating a new online culture, and that was what we've been trying to capture with our research.
Yeah.
Could you give an example of a topic that you've looked into and some of the steps you've taken in using this kind of analysis? Because I think it is very different from some of the kinds of the sort of, like you say, the broad brush big data approaches. So just walk us through an example briefly.
Well, we are in our book where this is basically a collection of empirical studies of very different interactional online or digital settings. So my chapter is particularly on video interaction between surgeons and patients. And this is relatively new as a type of data in the context of our network, because most of it has been on relatively public online interactions, and this is obviously not public. But for example, David's chapter is on Twitter. Maybe you can say something about the Twitter analysis, David?
Well, the my chapter is a sort of case study of a Twitter event, I suppose you could call it, where a well-known British broadcaster posted a tweet that was interpreted by many people as racist, and I was interested in really how the Twitter community, specifically those people who were following this broadcaster's account, went about raising their objections to the tweet, and how the broadcaster defended himself, and how his supporters or his followers were kind of divided between supporting him or trying to defend him or find excuses for him, or turning, maybe even turning against him. So it was really about how that event unfolded over a very short space of time, one evening in whenever it was, I can't even remember when it was now, a few years ago. And I suppose I'm trying to do two things with that chapter. On the one hand, I'm trying to kind of produce an anatomy of an online event, but I'm also drawing attention within the context of the book. This is to some of the challenges for researchers in doing this kind of analysis, because obviously with, I mean, a lot of the research I've done, so I'm jumping the gun a bit there. If you were to take a traditional conversation analytics study where maybe you had a phone call between two individuals, you would have a very clear interaction chain. So person A speaks, person B speaks, person A speaks, person B speaks, maybe there's a bit of overlap. Any of this goes on for a few minutes, and then they come to a conclusion. So that's a very simple piece, a very simple chain of interaction. Things become slightly more complicated once you start looking at things like discussion forums, which I've written about quite a lot, as Vika has in the past, where we've looked at how lots of different people can join in to a thread together. It can all contribute to a thread. It can last several days or months or years even. So it poses certain challenges which are different to those of traditional conversations, phone calls, and so on. But the Twitter data takes that another step further, because you've then got the other issue of the fact that, well, even more so than the discussion forum, you've got different experiences which are held by the different interactants in the discussion, and not to mention many, many more people who are seeing messages coming in at different times, often in different order. people having little conversations going off the kind of off piste, as it were, because they're maybe two people with small followings having an argument about the same event. Meanwhile, you've got the broadcaster having direct tweets with one or other of his various followers, those followers responding to those. So you've got all these different tentacles of the data stretching out, and all coming in at different times and not really forming a coherent chain of interaction like you would get with a traditional phone call or even a discussion forum thread. So I think it was really about looking at the complexity of that kind of technological context and trying to pick out relevant things from it, and how you eventually move from a very, very complicated interaction or dynamic to something that's analyzable and that can actually be interpreted as an event.
Yeah, and if I may jump in, because my my chapter was on maybe more traditional interaction in terms of doctors and patients, but I think looking at a video consultation specifically also raises similar complexities as in David's example, related, for example, to what's visible on screen and whether patients' companions are visible and to what extent they are visible or hearable to the physician on the other side, which introduces all kinds of complexity with regard to who's actually participating in the conversation and how do the participants negotiate this. And obviously this is more related to visual and on-screen aspects rather than maybe technological aspects and affordances like retweets and hashtags and all that sort of thing in Twitter. But I think the general sense is with our book, we are raising all kinds of questions and trying to examine these complexities without overstepping them immediately for the sake of, well, whatever generalization or quick results, or but to get a better sense of what these aspects mean for the interaction taking place.
Well, it seems like, I mean, in the two examples that you've given, I mean, with the surgeon and patients, where you have the question of like you say, who else is in the room, but also it's kind of what are you seeing in the frame of the camera, to what extent are you considering those elements in terms of, say, the home of the patient and the level of chaos or whatever is going on in the setting, is that become part of it, which is completely different from looking at, say, in the kinds of discussion forums and email chains and email lists that we had, in the earlier kinds of online interactions that were primarily text-based. And in some ways, I think you kind of alluded to this, David, I mean, somewhat linear. I mean, because someone posts and you've got this top level, and then there are responses. And even if there are responses to those comments, there's still kind of a linear, path that it goes through. So, I think, one of the points that you're making about the kind of nonlinear aspect, but then we also have the aspect of the visual, and, in some ways that is, say, more conscious, and in some ways, it's more, I don't want to say accidental, but it's kind of with the milieu of the research that where there all sorts of other elements that may come in. So maybe you could comment on that, and then I have another question.
Well, the visual material in social media is very important, and poses yet further challenges. And another point I was making in that particular case study was how when the sort of information you can glean from an environment like Twitter is something which isn't really taken into account in these more traditional methods like conversation analysis. For example, you can see most of the time, well, not obviously not all the time, but most of the time you can see who it is who is tweeting, and you can see things about that person. And that's when one of my research interests more generally is celebrity and celebrity interaction with audiences. And so so one of the ways in which I've found this kind of approach useful is in studying modern day celebrity or contemporary celebrity, where people are very much tied to their online identities, which is completely different to how the internet was being researched in the 90s, when people tended to see everything bound around anonymity and kind of playfulness and so on. Whereas, you know, in the contemporary world, you know, people put their intimate lives on view online, and a celebrity is, you know, the fact that we see the celebrity or someone who lots of people know tweeting means that we already, there's sort of person information which would never have been part of a traditional conversation analysis, for example. And you can't really ignore this kind of context, especially when it's a well-known person, and when that person has a history that their followers can allude to. You know, there's just so many more references that you can bring in to analyze that kind of interaction. So that's where the visual, I think, is very important. Even when it's not somebody well known, they might provide sort of contextual information about what sort of person they are. I did one study, for example, where I looked at authors and tried to separate out their followers into people who were other authors, people who were book bloggers, people who were fans, people who were kind of, you know, cognate professionals, if you like, doing, you know, in areas like publishing. And it was relatively easy to do because people put that sort of information on their profiles up front in Twitter. So you don't even need to follow their account to know what they do, as it were. So they've got these identities which are very much part of the interaction and have to kind of be factored in.
And sorry to add, but what just happened, my son entering the room, is exactly the type of thing that happens all the time. And it's the visual that interferes with the interaction in this case. So it is this kind of challenge.
It can interfere, but on the other hand, it can provide, you know, the researcher more of a sense of the environment the person is in and other, you know, elements of it that wouldn't be possible in other kinds of research. And I interviewed someone who was talking about how, you know, this person was studying children with disabilities, and being able to see the other family members interact with the child that was possible with the online interaction in the home that would not have been possible for them to get a sense of if the child was coming, you know, say into a clinic and doing the interview face to face. So, you know, it's everything that's a positive also has, you know, I mean, there's a positive and negative aspect of everything, but, you know,
No, that's true, but those are very general aspects, maybe. But I would then be interested in how is this organized locally? So what happens exactly at the moment someone enters the room, and how do we organize our conversation when these things happen? And at which point might one of you actually address my son? Had I kept my camera on, which I didn't. So it's all these kinds of things that we organize as human beings doing social or also institutional interactions. And I guess it's this kind of complexity that is a kind of general interest of the book and also of us as a network.
Right. Well, one other aspect of this kind of thread of conversation I wanted to ask you about. So, you know, if you're studying people who are, as you say, celebrities, authors, people who have crafted their online persona, and their identity and the images they use and the pictures and how current the picture might be, and how representative it might actually be, and the sharing in a very intentional way. But then you have on the other side the people who you really don't know who the heck these people are, because they're they've got a pseudonym or an avatar. They're not they're really screening their own real identity to create an artificial identity that provides some protection to them, especially around dealing with sensitive or controversial issues. So is that something that that you talk about in the book?
Well, not in this particular, yeah, not specifically in this chapter, but I mean, I've written about it elsewhere. But yes, I suppose yes, I mean, I've not really looked into it closely at anonymous profiles. It's not something I've been interested in yet.
No, I think most of the chapters are more focusing on how identities are constructed online. So rather than relating online identities or these kind of part of online identities or constructions thereof, linking them to potential offline identities, we've really focused on what's happening online. So one of the chapters is on the construction of online identities of expat bloggers, for example. So those who have migrated and who blog to their friends and family members tend to construct like local new build-up identities on the basis of their experience of being in a different country and what that means for their original national identity or so. So it's, I think we are more focusing on what's happening in the online environment rather than linking that to any offline context. Yeah.
So in the previous dialogue that we had around the article about kind of research ethics issues, and which I will link, so people watching this video can also read that. But in your work with this book, could you talk a little bit about how you how you address ethical factors in this kind of research, or what you recommend to researchers around those issues?
Yeah, there is a chapter on ethics in the book by Hannah Ditchfield, and she's basically reviewing quite a few of the relevant ethical aspects related to this type of research. Not coming to any quick solution, obviously, but it's merely advocating careful reflection on choices that are being made, and also, again, doing justice to the complexity. And I think the chapter pays particular attention also to the citation of data, which means in quite a few cases that actually the online persona are maybe retrievable on the basis of the quotation. So this is definitely something that we all are aware of, and that we feel is important to pay attention to, even though individual researchers make their own choices and find individual solutions. Yeah.
Right. So, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think it's one of the important things here with ethics is to do with the type of research that people are doing, the sort of people that they're studying, but also in a sense what they're trying to say about the data. If obviously there's huge differences between a study like the one that Vika wrote and the one that I wrote, because Vika's dealing with a very small number of well, actually dealing with a private encounter, essentially, that the individuals have consented to be recorded and analysed for the purpose of research, whereas I'm talking about something that's taking place in the world of Twitter, over which I've got absolutely no control.
Right.
I'm not interfering anyway. I'm simply reporting on what was going on. Although, having said that, then we go back to the whole question of how you identify something as an event, and of course, you've got huge inequalities between the individuals involved, between a celebrity with many thousands of followers and some of those followers who have probably got very small group numbers of followers, and I suppose, in a sense, from a point of view of how I would report that data, it would be more a matter of anonymizing people who certainly who don't have much of an online following, you know, who would be fairly anonymous within Twitter, and would probably not expect many people to read what they'd written or tweeted. Whereas I don't have any problems with identifying celebrities or people with thousands of followers who, in a sense, are on Twitter in order to be visible, and and have already kind of essentially consented to being studied, not necessarily in an academic context, of course, but certainly by opening the doors to their thousands and thousands of people to follow them. So if a researcher chooses to follow them and then to make public what they've been sharing on their Twitter feed, then I think that's probably not unreasonable, especially because, of course, the academic environment in which the book will be read or the papers will be read or whatever is going to be very exclusive, and it's hardly going to be something that's going to be picked up by the tabloid press.
Right. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about, you know, who you think will be using your book, and you know what how researchers can benefit from, you know, thinking through these approaches.
Well, I guess anyone interested in research on digital interaction is our audience, and that includes students, obviously, but also quite a few PhD students, because there was a book launch event in early or summer somehow, I can't remember the exact day.
June, I think.
June or July, yeah, and there were quite a few people who attended this online event, and apparently there was quite a big interest also of people who we'd never met before and were kind of new to us. But on that occasion, we decided, okay, we should again try to become a little bit more active as a network. So we've now decided to organize online data sessions again, and we invite anyone basically interested in this area of research to join the data sessions, and even to present some data that they would like to discuss. So so it's not a handbook in terms of you know, this is a 5-step procedure and you just follow our instructions. It doesn't work that way. So I guess the book is hopefully a kind of gives insight to people interested in what in digital interactions, on how to proceed and how to move through this kind of difficult area in some cases, and to give examples, showing people also what you can get out of this type of research.
Right. Well, thank you for talking with me about your book, and I hope that people viewing this will you know, have a chance to take a look at it and see because, you know, there really are not very many resources out there that provide guidance or, you know, clear examples for this kind of research, even though these interactions are, you know, so pervasive and have really become so much a part of the global culture, you know, especially, you know, throughout the pandemic. So again, you know, thanks for explaining a little bit more about, you know, your chapters in the book as a whole.
Yeah,
Thank you,
you're
Jen.
welcome. Thank you.